Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host Hannah Zuberi and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. Nations around the world have watched in horror at the treatment of protesters in the United States following the death of George Floyd. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers had imposed a curfew to prevent any further escalation. However, civil rights organizations have criticized the curfew, which restricts freedom of expression and freedom of speech, violating citizens' constitutional rights. Um, in fact, as we speak right now, the top United Nations Human Rights Council is has held a debate, an urgent debate on allegations of systematic racism, police brutality, and violence against peaceful protesters. Particularly concerned were African nations. Now, keep in mind, DC has a black mayor, Mayor Muriel Browser, and is also the hot seat of a president that has repeatedly targeted protesters from the White House and his Twitter handle. Mayor Browser has a rocky relationship with President Trump and is also criticized for not doing enough about police accountability in Washington, D.C. So joining us today is Tasneem Mutala. Tasneem is a fellow at Howard University School of Law at the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, where she also teaches and collects and co-directs Howard's Human and Civil Rights Clinic. The clinic looks towards includes projects including police brutality, prison conditions, reparations, immigration, and economic justice. He was the lead counsel in challenging the DC curfew laws against protesters. Previously, Tasneem represented and then held prisoners in Guantanamo and Bagram Air Force Base. So I am delighted to welcome our guest, Tasneem Mutala.
Thank you so much for having me, Hannah.
Thank you so much for being here. I know it's been a terribly busy 2 weeks for you, especially after the protest started. I just want to introduce more of your work and your background to our audience. So tell us about yourself, Tasneem. You went to law school at Yale, and then what have you been doing since then?
Sure. So I went to law school at Yale. I graduated a couple years back. Since then, I worked at a private law firm for a period of time. But more recently, I've been working at the Human and Civil Rights Clinic at Howard University School of Law. So for those who aren't familiar, law school clinics are basically experiential courses which students can take in which they work on real life cases under the supervision of a professor, which is me. So we've taken on a lot of different cases and, we try to be responsive to things that are happening day to day, particularly in the DC community. We feel like at Howard, we have a particular responsibility to work on cases and projects that affect our immediate community. When two different things happened in this past few months and weeks that have really kind of redirected our focus. And one's obviously the COVID pandemic. And a lot of our work has now been focusing on, how do we get people out of prison in the COVID pandemic? How do we make sure that lawmakers are taking into account the racial disparities in how COVID impacts different communities? And then the second thing that we've been working on, of course, is these mass numbers of protests that have been occurring after the murder of George Floyd. And so we've been working on a lot of different issues related to that, from challenging these curfew laws, which Hannah had kind of highlighted, which really were aimed at stopping protesters from being able to exercise their First Amendment rights and criminalizing their ability to protest. And then also, helping representing victims of police brutality who've been brutalized in the course of their protests, and also kind of bringing these issues to the international front. And you highlighted how the United Nations today had a debate on basically police brutality and the racialized police brutality in the United States. And so we're looking at how can we use these international human rights mechanisms to hold the United States to account.
And that's really interesting because usually we talk about civil rights in the United States, and so how do you feel working at it from a human rights framework.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think usually when we think about domestic issues, we think of these are civil rights issues, right? So like the right to vote, the right to have due process and not be arrested without a fair trial. Those sorts of things we traditionally think of these are core civil rights issues, but really they're all also international human rights issues. And I don't think the United States, people in the United States use the language of international human rights enough. And I think part of that is just because the United States government doesn't really pay too much attention to their international human rights obligations. So under international law, the United States is required to, have to respect human rights laws, obligations, and treaties. And they oftentimes don't. And I think because U.S. lawmakers tend to not pay too much attention to these obligations, domestically we don't pay attention to them as much. But they really are a useful framework because they're far more expansive even than our U.S. Constitution. On the international front, there's rights to socioeconomic rights. There's far more expansive rights for people who are detained. There's the death penalty, for example, something that's under international human rights law is frowned upon. But domestically, I think because we're so used to kind of our constitutional framework, we tend to not think about how the international law and international human rights can help us provide us the language and also the weight to support our movements.
I have been so I wanted to walk the audience through what happened in June. So we have some,
Sure.
Like the protesters, they were out there, and I think we have some photographs that we want to show of, people gathering in, and we, both me and you have been in those squares hundreds of times, right?
Right.
Protesting everything from, oppression overseas to local, dreamers cases, all sorts of protests that take place in that park. And so to see tear gas and to see, and now we have Mayor Bowser has actually painted this relationship that she's had with Trump, and she challenged him with this large street mural that says Black Lives Matter. But many in the Black Lives Movement are looking at that mural in horror because of her past history with policing. So let's talk a little bit about this.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's very common nowadays for us to see kind of democratic and progressive candidates and government and lawmakers take this strong stance against Trump because they kind of see this is how I galvanize my base. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes they very much work hand in hand with a lot of the same systems that empower Trump. Mm-hmm. And they oftentimes weaponize those systems against people they supposedly, serve. Mm-hmm. So with Mayor Bowser, what happened was that when she instituted the curfew, she essentially kind of gave Trump the keys or the go-ahead to use this federal law enforcement against protesters in DC. So very soon after the curfew was enacted, I think just basically a couple hours later, President Trump, gave that infamous speech in the Rose Garden where he then walked over to the church on Lafayette Park. And he said that he was going to be using the National Guard and other sorts of federal law enforcement to enforce Mayor Bowser's curfew. And so this just really kind of highlights how Mayor Bowser's curfew isn't just something that, affects her. It's not just something that she's enforcing. It's something that Trump and all of the federal, the federal law enforcement he has behind him were able to enforce. And so when she issued that curfew, she essentially empowered Trump to bring out the National Guard. And all these other federal agencies too. When I went out there, I saw drug enforcement agencies. There was ICE. I've heard there are allegations of ICE. There were Secret Service. There were all these other sort of federal agencies that really have no business operating against protesters that were out there. And Mayor Bowser criminalizing protests. She gave Trump the kind of go-ahead to use all of that use all those sources of force against protesters.
And what happens for those? A lot of people don't even know what a curfew is. A lot of people just think, oh, it's be home by 10, right?
Right.
What happens during curfews? What rights are taken away? What happens if I was out during a curfew? What would happen to me?
Yeah, so this curfew was kind of put out really kind of spur of the moment. No one really expected it. And interestingly enough, if you looked at the curfew language, she basically couched it as an enforcement mechanism to protect the city of DC against COVID-19. So she almost said it was like a public health purpose, but we know that's not true. She instituted it right after these protests kind of started happening. So, and we've been battling COVID-19 since at least March, and there were never any, restrictions or curfews in place in that way. Sure, she had social distancing guidelines, but there was never something like, I'm going to bring out the National Guard if we see you on the streets after 7 p.m. And so, yeah, when the curfew first started, I believe started at 7 p.m. And for people who, I think on the first few nights, it differed from night to night, but certain nights, if people were allowed out around 7 p.m., even though they're technically violating curfew. But at some points, the law enforcement was basically kind of what we call caroling. So they basically put them in specific blocks. They solely push protesters into one specific area, and they use that as a mechanism for arresting, doing actually mass arrests. So we saw this most, I think, visibly on the Swan Street block. And I think people might recall that there was they had basically herded all the protesters into one specific area. And the protesters weren't being accused of any, violence. They weren't being accused of breaking anything. They weren't accused of anything beyond just being outside after curfew. And so just keep that in mind. Just, and the curfew, the sun sets here around like 8:30. So, you still have like a good hour and a half of sunlight, and people are out on the streets and are still violating curfew. And so you have this group of people now on Swan Street, and they have law enforcement on every single side trying to basically arrest them. And we had a resident of a house on Swan Street who let, I think, about 60 people in, and they basically were there seeking refuge until the curfew was lifted, I think around 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah, we saw of people actually go saying, I need to, I need someone somewhere to go. Does anybody know? And people were sharing.
Yeah.
It was, it was watching what history take place, like right.
It's something. Yeah, it's something. We hear about it in places like Kashmir. We hear about it in other places. We never expect to see that in DC. And another thing about this curfew is that there was just really no further explanation or details given. So, for example, you saw this especially in places like New York. Healthcare workers were coming home late at night, were arrested. We've seen Black healthcare workers who were assaulted and then arrested by police officers. Food deliveries workers, so like Uber Eats and Postmates workers, weren't sure if they were considered essential workers. We also saw instances of them being arrested who were caught up in the curfew. And really what we see, especially in New York, we see that these curfews were used as a pretense to brutalize protesters. And I'll give you like one very specific example, and it's not covered too much in the news. And I think the reason why it's not covered so much in the news is because this is a predominantly Black area of New York. And in Mott Haven in the Bronx, there was a large group of protesters, largely residents of this majority minority neighborhood, who were protesting on the streets. And at some point, again, the police kettled them into a few blocks. They were surrounded by within these few blocks, and we had children, we had elderly people out there. And basically, as soon as the clock struck 8 p.m., which was when the time the curfew set in New York, the police used it as a pretense to brutalize them. They essentially caved in on them. You saw, children being affected. You saw, people being trampled. People had respiratory issues, felt like they couldn't breathe. And, from there, we saw mass arrests. And I think the numbers in New York are in the thousands in terms of people who were arrested. And really, the only thing that
arrested in DC,
I think the number that we saw was 400. And I think at least half of them were arrested solely for violating curfew. And that's the numbers that the police have given us. So obviously the numbers could be different. It probably might even be more than that were arrested solely for breaking curfew. But yeah, so really we've seen this curfew as kind of just a way to empower the state to deter protesters from protesting, to punish protesters from protesting, and really to kind of send a message that says, if you're out here at these times, this is what is going to happen to you.
And so I have one of the things that people are worried about is what if Trump uses these curfews to install martial law across the country?
Mm.
We've already seen, like, shopkeepers in Sacramento asking for the National Guard to come in to protect their shops, things like that. Like, what if that call grows? Like, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so it really, we have to kind of understand that the United States is a federalist country. So basically what that means is that we have a federal government that's quite strong, but also there are specific rights reserved to states and localities.
Okay.
So my understanding is that President Trump can't necessarily dictate that the entire country fall under martial law. That's something that will ultimately be under the kind of the sovereignty of each individual state. So for example, if Virginia wanted to say that we are going to be now imposing martial law, that's something they would be able to do, but it wouldn't. But President Trump himself will not be able to kind of institute it on a nationwide basis. And that's also a comparison that you see with the National Guard. So the National Guard can't be deployed to a state without that state government's acquiescence. Mm-hmm. In DC, it's a little bit different, right? Because DC is not a state, doesn't necessarily have the rights as a state. And if anything, the events of these past few weeks really highlight why DC should have statehood and should have these sorts of rights, especially when you have it's such a large minority population in a city. They certainly historically if history shows that these people need to have their rights to vote.
I'm going to let our audience know that the Congress is poised to pass a DC statehood bill next week. This is the first time in U.S. history either chamber will approve legislation granting the district full representation and voting rights in Congress. They're supposed to vote on it, and it's historic. And we've seen even people like Congressman Steny Hoyer, who has opposed the statehood for the past 30 years, say that this is just not an issue of local governance and fairness. It's a major civil rights issue as well. And he's also gone on to say that if I just cross over, move from Maryland into DC, would I be a lesser citizen? So that means for all this time, can you tell us a little bit more about what statehood means to DC?
Sure. So, I mean, if you drive through DC, you'll see a lot of the license plates, taxation without representation. And essentially what that means is that people here in DC pay federal taxes, yet they have no voting rights in Congress. We have a representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton, but she does not have voting rights, nor does DC have a senator. It's unclear whether there's going to be any sort of proposals for DC to have a senator. My understanding is that might require a constitutional amendment, but it would mean that at least DC might have voting rights in the House, which is huge. I mean, this is a large population with a not insignificant number of minorities, and the fact that they can now be they pay federal taxes but yet have no representation, it would be huge for them. And additionally, I think it will help delineate kind of the bounds of the federal government over DC. So, just again, highlighting how DC ordinances can be weaponized by the federal government against DC citizens. Perhaps a statehood bill might kind of properly delineate what is the role of the federal government in the city of DC, and do they have a right to empower their federal law enforcement against DC citizens and residents.
And this is something that Bowser said as well, right? She said there shouldn't be troops from other states in Washington, D.C., and federal forces advancing against American citizens. And there definitely shouldn't be soldiers stationed across our city waiting for the go to attack Americans in a local policing matter. So this major tussle between the president and the mayor. What does that mean? Like we did see, like not even just uniformed officers. We saw almost like how you see in Afghanistan. I don't recall what exactly that they're called. These are people who are not in uniform, but they're security forces. What are they, and what were they doing in DC?
Yeah, so we've heard a lot of different reports. We've heard of private militia being in DC. So we've heard of, contractors similar to what we saw in like Blackwater in Iraq. We've heard reports of something similar being seen in DC. We've seen National Guard. I understand that like the National Guard from Utah was being was staying in hotels here in DC, ready to be deployed. And it is very troubling. It gives you the sense that the residents and people of DC are an enemy force, to which must respond in with like military tanks and military officials. And but I think just also to contextualize it, like this is what we see across the world, and I mean, it gives us a little bit of a taste of how, you know, when the U.S. does U.S. When the U.S. goes and invades another country, this is what those everyday citizens see too, and it kind of gives you a sense of what it's like to live under siege. And then a second point is that it highlights how jarring it is when you have a militarized law enforcement domestically. I think we see this across the country. Local law enforcement have purchased military grade weapons, tanks, military grade guns, and things like that, ballistic assault rifles. And they don't really know how to use it. They haven't received the proper training for it. Two, they're receiving it at a discount from this sort of Pentagon leasing program, and they're using it against their civilians. And it's really kind of just highlights how there really is this us versus them mentality between law enforcement and the communities in which they're supposed to be protecting.
And how does this translate into this movement to defund police? Like how do you see? Can you? What do you?
Yeah, of course. So I mean, these local law enforcement agencies receive huge number, have huge budgets, oftentimes surpassing and local education budgets, healthcare budgets, etc. And so it really shows where the priorities are for a state or a local government when they're putting so much money into buying these military tanks that they're unable to pay their teachers. And it just kind of highlights the disparity. And I think this is kind of just comparable when you think about the federal funding, but federal budgets. So where are our priorities there? If you compare the DoD budget to the Social Security budget towards the Medicare budget, and you kind of see like why are we spending trillions of dollars on one hand for something that we really don't need, versus these other things that are so important to everyday citizens' lives.
This reminds me of like we were talking about earlier as well, that the UN had an urgent debate on this,
Right.
where African countries particularly are concerned about people of African descent being in the United States, and citizens as well as non-citizens, immigrants, uh, as well as the people who were brought over and enslaved. What have you heard about the debate, and what is some of the work? I know you all are doing. The Thurgood Marshall Center is doing some work at the United Nations as well. So,
Sure, yeah. So essentially for a good chunk of this morning, the United Nations Human Rights Council, well, it was afternoon in Geneva, but the UN Human Rights Council was allowed statements from different countries, country representatives, allowing them to kind of express their concern about the use of police brutality against Black Americans. It's really interesting to kind of just see all these other countries calling America to account. I think America is often kind of seen as a hypocrite on the international stage, and I think this was kind of another example of the time when when the United States loves criticizing other people's human rights abuses, but very rarely do they navel gaze and think about it all the ways that they're abusing their citizens' human rights. So it was interesting to see. It was spearheaded by specific African countries, but it wasn't just African countries that were chiming in. I listened to a bit of it, and I heard statements from representatives from Japan, from Jordan, from the Netherlands, and so it really was kind of wide scale across the world. Countries were kind of chiming in to raise the alarm. But again, this is not something new. Last year, we worked with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is a regional human rights body that focuses, that covers Central, North, Central, and South America. And we had a hearing they published a report looking at the police brutality against people of African descent, so Black Americans, and they highlighted all the different ways in which the United States government has failed their human rights obligations. And I think oftentimes, we talk about it's very hard on an international level to hold the United States to account because oftentimes the United States' response is, hey, especially under the Obama administration, they say, hey, we as the federal government, we agree with you wholeheartedly. We don't think that there should be police brutality. We don't think that there should be implicit bias. We don't think there should be military grade weapons on the street. But these are the local actors that are doing it. These are, this is the Ferguson Police Department. This is the New Orleans Police Department. That's not us, right? And the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights very eloquently said that, as a federal government, you have the rights, you have the authority, and you have the obligation to hold these local actors accountable. And there's different ways that you can do that. In international law, you can't, as a federal government, say that we can wash our hands of this because there are other actors that are in place. As long as it's within your territory and it's within your sovereignty, it's your responsibility. And although that hasn't gotten we haven't had that conversation at the UN yet, that is something that's definitely going to have to be discussed. I think during the Obama years, it was very easy for us to say on the federal level, oh well, of course Obama cares about this. Well, a lot of activists will disagree, but I think it was a lot easier for people to not pay attention because they felt that the DOJ and other sorts of federal agencies were on board with protecting the lives of Black protesters, protecting the lives of people against police brutality. And that it really was a local problem. But I think gone are the days when we can say that, and I don't even think that was necessarily true to begin with.
Wow, this is and when we, and I'm going to lean on you because you've done human rights work, you've worked with prisoners in Guantanamo, and this is something that I wanted to let's broaden. Like we've been looking at DC, but a lot of things are happening in New York. And what are the parallels that you're seeing, and how do we move? Like how are human rights organizations and civil rights organizations? Do you think what's the trajectory forward?
Yeah, I think that, specifically for Muslim activists, I think a lot of times we focus on a lot of the international human rights issues, which are obviously they're important. They're crucial. There's genocide occurring, crimes against humanity that are occurring abroad. And I think it's important for us to strengthen our causes if we draw parallels and connections between those movements, because really we are all one movement. And there's the same systems of oppression that are in place in Palestine as they are here in the United States, in Kashmir as they are, in the United States as well. And so it's really important that we kind of be aware and cognizant of that. So I'll give you some examples. So, DC MPD, the Metropolitan Police Department, they actually are trained in Israel by the IDF. And so the same sort of the same sort of kettling techniques that they use, the same sort of, examples of how to use military grade weapons, the place where they get a lot of that training is Israel. And so when we think about how are we going to challenge, the oppressive mechanisms that the Zionist state uses, that's the same sort of way that we're going to challenge it here. And it's important to kind of draw connections. When we think about, who is building the prisons in Israel, who is building the prisons in India, a lot of times it's the same military contractors that are building the prisons over here. It's the same sort of prison contractors who are building prisons on the border, where immigrant children, immigrant families are being detained indefinitely. So it's really important for us to kind of be cognizant of that, and be aware that these are all the same sort of systems of oppression that are in place.
This is and that this weaponization that you are seeing of curfews, this is also a very international topic, right? You see this on the streets against protesters across the world. So what are some things that have worked, and how do you or your organization plan to represent some of these, for example, non-essential, essential workers that might have been on the streets, and are you trying to get them out? Can you, or are there other organizations that are working on that?
Yeah, so thankfully the curfew has been rescinded in both the DC and New York, but that doesn't mean that there isn't still work to be done. Like I said, a lot of
the curfew rescind. Like, how did that? so
Oh,
quickly?
so basically what happened was we filed suit at some point, I guess like maybe a week and a half ago.
Okay.
And I think the next day, within 24 hours, DC announced that they would be rescinding their curfew. I like to say this response to our lawsuit. And then it's similarly in New York. We were filing suit in New York with a couple other civil liberty organizations. So the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Legal Aid Society, and Center for Constitutional Rights. And we were gonna file it on Monday, and we informed the New York Solicitor General that we'd be filing on Monday, and on Sunday they rescinded it. So I think it does kind of show the power of the law and the power of litigation in some ways to help. But also this litigation was obviously supported and pushed through with the help of the movement, with the help of the protesters. If it weren't for protesters who are putting their lives on the line, their bodies on the line, their time on the line, for all we know, that these curfew laws would still be in place. So I'd hate to take credit for it when really there are so many other people who quite physically put themselves on the line to make it happen.
The Thurgood Marshall Center also filed a case in April. Can you tell us more about that case?
Yeah, sure. So we actually we filed an amicus brief in April. So basically, an amicus brief is a front of the court brief in which we basically submit basically provide kind of additional context to a case that was already going in front of the Supreme Court. So that case was Doe v. McKesson, in which DeRay McKesson, who some of you might know, he's a prominent Black Lives Matter activist. He was organizing a protest down in New Orleans, or he wasn't organizing. He was actually attending a protest. I think he tweeted about this protest in New Orleans. During the course of the protest, protesters blocked a city street, which is again very common protest tactic. Mm-hmm. And through the course of that protest, a police officer was harmed by a projectile. It's unclear what hit the police officer, who threw what at the police officer, but a police officer was hit. Mm-hmm. This police officer then sued all of Black Lives Matter and also DeRay, arguing that because DeRay, was involved in the protest as a protest leader, he should be liable for the assault that this police officer received.
Oh, wow.
And the district court, so the lowest court, basically looked at this and said, no, of course not. He was just practicing his First Amendment rights. There's no connection between DeRay and this projectile that was thrown at you. We're gonna dismiss the suit. It was then taken to the appeals court, which is a very conservative court. It's when 3 judges look at it and decide. And originally, all 3 judges said, no, you know what? Actually, we're going to reverse. We think that there is a case to be made. I think that if you're blocking a street, you should be able to predict that some violence will sort of occur against the police. So yeah, I think we can hold you liable. And then about a month later, one of the judges, who actually was a Trump judge, had a change of heart. And he basically came back and wrote a dissent saying, I thought this through a little bit more, and I disagree. I think that, this is a huge infringement on First Amendment rights. If it will just open up a can of worms if we're allowing just random protesters to be held liable for injuries that they didn't direct or incite. And I'm going to change course. But of course, since this was still a 2-3 opinion, right now the law in that area is that yes, you can be held liable, and so it's being appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has not yet decided whether they're going to take this case on. So the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, with our clinical students, we wrote a brief which basically highlighted how if this law were to remain, or this interpretation of the law were to remain as it is, would disproportionately affect Black protest. And just kind of on a legal matter, the Fifth Circuit completely kind of disregarded what precedent is on this issue. Mm-hmm. And the precedent on this issue is the most well case that kind of speaks to this issue is a case called NAACP v. Claiborne, which was a case about civil rights protests in the 60s. And essentially in that case, the court said that, even if some protesters are committing violence, you can't hold another individual liable for that violence unless they've directed, incited, or provoked the violence. And so similarly in this case, because DeRay did not direct, incite, or provoke. the violence.
Even just that doesn't make sense to me. How would you prove that someone was inciting violence?
Right. So like unless right. And even saying like, oh, I think we should burn the city down doesn't even count as violence, right? Like that you have to really be like, here are the weapons in which you must use to provoke the violence. And everyone go throw these weapons. Like that would be an incitement to violence. It really is a very, very, very strict threshold, because the United States, for better or for worse, has very strong First Amendment protections. And so kind of on the legal matters, just the Fifth Circuit, the appellate court, which said the case could continue, was just really out of line with what the precedent is. But also kind of just providing some more context, we highlighted how when we think about what is foreseeable violence, which is kind of what the Fifth Circuit created, like when you protest, is there going to be is violence foreseeable? And if it's foreseeable, then you can be held liable. We said, how are courts going to look at that, right? If you compare Black protests, which we've seen over the last few weeks, has been met with military tanks, tear gas, rubber bullets. Compare that to white protest. Let's think about the people who are protesting against masks and wanting to get their hair cut, like they're in Michigan. They had no sort of police brutality against them. Which one are they going to say is more likely to be violent? And they're obviously, a court's going to look at it, and they're obviously going to say a Black protest is more likely to be violent. And why is that? Because the police always respond to Black protests with violence. And so we highlighted how this standard is just so problematic, because it creates a standard where Black protests are going to be looked at a different in a different way than white protests. And we wrote this even before the last few months came about. We wrote this we submitted in April. This was before we've seen the disparity between such a clear disparity between the way anti-mask protesters in Michigan were and George Floyd.
Our audience can identify with that, because that was scary to see armed with like military weapons, people on the steps of your city hall or your governor's house, and nothing is being said to them. They're considered peaceful protesters, even though they're armed up the woods.
Right, exactly. And we highlighted that, for example, in Charlottesville, right? So I think, was it 3 years in Charlottesville when you had all these white supremacists come down, and they were ready to riot. They came down. Were messaging sending around message boards, be prepared for violence. The hospitals were gearing up, ready for violence. But they would. Oh, if you look at the way the police responded to them, it was never with military tactics. It was never with tear gas or rubber bullets. They were just saying, oh, they're there to practice their First Amendment rights. Compare that to any sort of Black Lives Matter protest, how differently the two are treated. And how I think it's also just highlights how there's so many different laws in place on the civil side, on the criminal side. And these are just always disproportionately used to target and to limit people of color-led protests, but particularly Black-led protests.
And so how does this, so a lot of things that the pushback that I've seen from many people, and even people in the Muslim community as well, is that is the looting, right? That's what is referred to, and what's been shown and highlighted in media. And so in all, your perspective, what is, and majority of them, like, we just doing research for this show, majority of the videos that came in were just regular people just marching down the street and yelling and just protesting like they should be, or that is their right. So how like that view, right, that we're seeing right now, and what does that do to the First Amendment? Like, what and how do we, as a nation, make sure that we can protect the rights, the freedom of speech? We can, and be supporters of that, so that doesn't happen. What we're seeing on the street, on the camera right now.
Right. Yes, I think you raised a couple of different points, right? So I think the looting point, I think oftentimes it's just in some ways used as a distraction from what is really the main issue here. People are out protesting as a way to express their frustration, reclaim their dignity. get government officials to pay attention to something that the government's been complicit in and oftentimes has turned a blind eye to, and that's the extrajudicial murder of Black people. And I think that really, when people focus on the looting, you always have to ask, well, why is the looting the issue that's causing you concern? Why isn't it the issue that George Floyd was killed? Why isn't it the issue that Sandra Bland was killed? Why isn't name your innocent Black person who was killed by police forces? And once you become as outraged about those, then we can talk about the looting. And then kind of a second point is that you get when one is constantly subject to this sort of police brutality, sort of violence, this sort of without any accountability. There's been no accountability mechanisms for people who've committed this. It gets exhausting and it gets frustrating, and at some point you do boil over. And I'm not one to critique someone who what methods they use to express their frustration, and at some point this is property damage, but it's pale in comparison to the sort of physical, physiological, emotional damage, economic damage that's been done to Black people in this country since its founding. So like part of me says, it's sure it's unfortunate, but there's a larger issue at play here, and I think that's where our priority should be. And then I think kind of your third point was, again, like maybe perhaps from a First Amendment perspective, how is this looked at? And I think it. So once again, you can't hold all protesters liable or guilty for the acts of some. So when we see these sort of like curfews being put into place, when we see mass arrests, and the ostensible purpose of these has been because there's been looting, that violates the First Amendment. Any sort of restrictions against First Amendment activity have to be very narrowly tailored. So if you're instituting a curfew, you have to say, who does that apply to? Why does it apply to? Why is this the most narrow way of us getting to our result? And so blanket curfews, blanket mass arrests, blocking of major streets from protesters, those are not the narrow ways that the First Amendment allows the government to restrict protesters' rights. It really has to be the most narrow option available, and the sorts of things that DC, New York, other places have imposed are not narrowly tailored to meet that.
So, one thing that I was thinking of, so these 2,000 or like 400 people that were arrested, and doesn't that also feed into this whole prison industrial complex? Because now they have to be bailed out, right? So where does that money go? Do they get any of that back? Like, how does that work?
How does the bail system work? Sure. So DC eliminated bail, so it's not really an issue here in DC. New York also instituted some bail reform. So technically what would happen is that those people were supposed to basically be, I think, arraigned within 24 hours and then should have been released, but that's not happened. And so technically the way bail works is that you're held for a period of time, you receive an arraignment, and then you're released on bail, which is a amount that a judge kind of dictates, which basically says, like, you have to post this amount, and basically just kind of like as a guarantee that you're going to show up to your court date. And if you can't make that, if you can't pay for that amount, then you're going to be detained. And so if New York had a kind of a huge recall of their bail system, a lot of times because I think majority of the people that were in Rikers before their bail reform were people that were held on pretrial detention. So these are people who weren't even charged with anything; they just were unable to make bail.
Wow.
Yeah, so like I think you might recall the case of Khalif Browder. He was a young man who was held in Rikers pretrial for a crime he did not commit, and he was held in solitary confinement for a period of time, and the permanent scars that being in Rikers and on solitary did to him, he ultimately committed suicide after he was released, and he was also acquitted of all charges. And it's just a really horrific, horrendous system. But sorry, that was kind of an aside. But so basically what happens is if you post your bail, and then you go to trial, that money then basically goes back into the system. So like when you see these bail funds, that money is then released back to the people who posted the bail. And so it can be reused for someone else's bail in the future. So that's why a lot of people have been saying, make sure you if you're looking for somewhere to donate to a bail fund, because that money is going to it's going to basically recycle over and over again to support people who've been arrested.
So, and that's something else that we just noticed too. Like, I believe the Minnesota Bail Fund collected $25 million, and that's awesome. But now, what's the accountability? Who's running it? And it turns out it's a white-run organization. It's not a black-run organization. So a lot of these are like layers and layers that you start off.
Yeah. I will say, like, I'm not super familiar with the Minnesota Bail Fund, but from my understanding, it's like a very leanly staffed organization, 2 to 3 people. They probably weren't prepared for a $25 million bail fund. And I know and I think a lot of people have kind of been like, raising eyebrows to the fact that they've only dispersed $200,000. But I think that, that's just the nature of it. They're probably just figuring out a system in order to do it. But it is true. One should make sure to do their research before donating. There are a lot of people who do try to take advantage of the situation. So when you are donating money, make sure you do your research, look for things that are reputable and that organizations that you trust and support are behind and backed.
Definitely. So we have about 10 minutes. Then I really wanted to also talk about some of your other work since we have you here. I know and this is something that's close to both of our hearts. You've worked on the Rohingya cause. So let me know, I want to hear more about the report. What was it used for? What were your findings on it?
Sure. So back in 2015, an organization called Fortify Rights, which is an on-the-ground organization that focuses on the rights of people in Myanmar, particularly Rohingya, but also other human rights issues affecting other minority groups in Myanmar. They came to my human rights clinic when I was in law school and said, we have been constantly, we look at the situation in Myanmar against the Rohingya. We understand if it's what under international law is called crimes against humanity, but people are constantly asking us, is this genocide? And they wanted us to provide kind of a legal analysis to examine the situation on the ground and to come to a legal determination of whether the legal requirements of genocide were met. And I think oftentimes we heard
I was asking them. Fortify Rights is a very close.
Oh, really? Okay, great. And so I think oftentimes we hear the term genocide a lot, but I don't think we oftentimes realize that it actually is it's a legal term and it has specific legal requirements. And it's oftentimes, it's hard to meet it. And so you have to kind of look at specific situation on the ground and kind of look at the law of genocide as international courts and tribunals have defined it. And so what we essentially did is we looked at testimony that Fortify Rights provided us from Rohingya people who've experienced mass atrocities, unspeakable atrocities at the hands of both the Myanmar government and kind of local villagers, which like local Burmese villagers and kind of the Burmese government turned a blind eye towards. And we basically came to a legal conclusion that the elements of genocide were met. However, we also requested that the UN create a commission of inquiry into the situation where they formally examined all the facts on the ground and come to kind of a UN determination as to whether a genocide was occurring.
And so now, are there plans to have such a similar inquiry for Black lives in the United States?
Yeah, so actually human rights organizations have kind of sounded the alarm to say that the situation of Black Americans does require a commission of inquiry. Just to give kind of a background, commissions of inquiry are basically kind of they're a commission of experts essentially that go into a specific area and they investigate it and determine, kind of come to an impartial determination of what is exactly occurring under international law. And so oftentimes we'll require them to do fact finding and reporting and going onto the ground and interviewing people and taking testimony, but also requires them talking to the state government that's implicated. So they would have to, get a statement from the United States government to say, like, what's your version of events? What is your understanding of the international law as it relates to what's occurring here? So it requires a cooperation of both kind of what we might view as victims and also perpetrator.
And so, how would that translate to support DC? Or so would that be an investigation into the DC Police Department, or what would that look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I haven't seen a commission of inquiry into something as vast as the United States, and particularly an issue as vast as the police brutality in the United States. We've seen it before, kind of in Syria. We have seen it in Myanmar. We saw it in Darfur, and those issues were complicated and complex as well. I think it's in some ways it's harder here because, as you highlight, we have thousands of local law enforcement agencies. We have, this kind of systemic issues that go back to this country's founding, and then we have this distinction between the federal government and local government. So I think that it would probably look like a combination of both liaising with the federal government, but also interviewing and fact finding and reporting on the local level as well. So they probably would go back and look at what are some instances of extreme police brutality. I imagine they'd probably look at Ferguson. I imagine they'd probably look at instances in New Orleans and Chicago, and kind of go out to the local level as well.
So I know you worked in Guantanamo too, right? And you were looking at tell us more about that work. And really, and after doing that research and after doing that work, what is your opinion of the conditions of the prisons in the United States right now?
Yeah, it's so I represented men held in Guantanamo Bay from 2014 to 2016 or so. And so it was during that time, it was, obviously Obama was the president, but there was a large number of men who were, all the men, or most of the men that are held without trial or charge. But they're frustrated because Obama came into office promising that he was going to close the prison. And, a number of these men were cleared for release. The process of getting cleared for release is really stringent. A number of government agencies have to basically sign off on this individual and saying that they are no longer a threat. And a number of them had done that, and yet they were still being held there. So in response, some of them had started hunger striking, and the government's response to that was to force feed them. And it's a really torturous method that they use to force feed men there. They strap them down. They put like really heavy liquids. They're more like slushy liquids through tubes and force it into them. It's a very painful process. It happens like through the course of the night. In the middle of the night, all of a sudden they'll come into their cell and force feed them. So the men there were like living through this were essentially being re-traumatized. It was very similar to the torture that they experienced before getting into Guantanamo Bay. So I think working there was in some ways, I think for a lot of people who do human rights work, particularly under like the Obama administration, they oftentimes felt like they were fighting an uphill battle from progressives and Democrats just signing on.
It's easier now to do human rights work than it was.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of times people people who view themselves as liberal kind of treated people who were criticizing the Obama government as essentially social pariahs. You criticize Obama on drones, you criticize Obama on Guantanamo, all these other things, his military escapades abroad, and you just get a backlash from both the left and the right. So in some ways that was kind of very different from the situation where we're living in now, where people are, both Democrats, Republicans are condemning police brutality and that sort of thing. But at the same time, I think we see Guantanamo has oftentimes been framed as this exceptional place, right? Like people that have been held there were tortured. They created this prison facility to purposely prevent these men access to U.S. domestic courts. They're not held without charge or trial. They're kind of vaguely called enemy combatants, and what does that mean? And I think that oftentimes we hear, when people talk about Guantanamo, they talk about it as if like this is this very exceptional circumstance to respond to these very extreme sorts of terrorists. And one, that's not true. Like I said, a lot of these men were cleared for release and just been waiting to get on a plane home. Two, they've never been tried as terrorism. But also, kind of taking a step back, if you go to a prison in the United States, it's not necessarily any better. People are being held in solitary confinement, 23-hour lockup. They experience similar sorts of brutalities. They are similarly dehumanized. Sure, they might have access to courts, but I mean, if sometimes, your court-appointed lawyer, not always, I think public defenders are generally fantastic, but sometimes you get a court-appointed lawyer who doesn't, completely incompetent, or sometimes you have to pay for a lawyer who's completely incompetent. The justice system, you have these judges who are elected and really just care about being tough on crime to win re-election. We don't necessarily, we create this kind of dichotomy between like, oh, the United States' criminal justice system really is, where we should be trying all these people because it's going to provide them these sorts of protections, and it's going to, it supports due process, and people here in prison are going to be treated with rights and dignity, versus Guantanamo Bay. But that's not necessarily the case. And this goes back to kind of like my earlier comment, where these are all the same sort of systems at place. What Guantanamo was created and it grew from and evolved from, and it was empowered by the domestic criminal justice system. And these sorts of systems have been in place since its founding. It derives from the way the United States was created, on the backs of and through the abuse of Black people. And you can't divorce the two. What's Guantanamo is only possible because of what we have here in the United States today.
Well, thank you so much, Justine, for joining us today. Great discussion, and
Right.
I'm really hoping to follow up with you and see where this takes us at the United Nations. And thank you all for joining us today. June 19th is Juneteenth. On June 20th, the Poor People's Campaign is asking everybody to join in their gathering online. So we welcome you to that. You'll find out more about it on Justice for All now, and on our website, justiceforall.org. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you for having me. This is really great to talk to you.
Thank you.